I want to talk to you for just a moment about conflict. Happy topic, I know, right? But the truth is, you can't be involved in church for very long without experiencing some conflict. You can't be involved really in any relationship in life, whether it's a friendship or a family or a marriage, without at some point experiencing some conflict. And how we deal with that conflict is going to determine the outcomes, not just of that situation, but oftentimes the outcomes of the directions that we go way down the road in our life. So I was reading this passage yesterday, Genesis chapter 13, that I've read a number of times, but I noticed some things in it that I had never thought of before. So I want to give you a little bit of backstory and talk for just a moment about conflict. Genesis chapter 13, we are introduced to a man named Abram who will eventually become Abraham. And God comes to him and he says, I want you to go. I want you to move. But God doesn't tell him where he wants him to go. How often do you feel like God has a plan for you, but you have absolutely no idea what he has in mind? Well, this was Abram's story. And so Abram picks up and he goes, but he doesn't go all the way. He only goes a part of the way. He gets waylaid, stopped on his journey. He loses God's path, and the cause of it actually was family. Very interesting. Go back to Genesis 13 and check it out. But eventually, Abram gets back on the right path, following God, but it's not all going to be perfect from here on out, because he now meets up with his nephew Lot, and they end up staying for a time in the same place, a place that Genesis 13 tells us is named Bethel, which means house of God. So here you have Lot, and here you have Abram, and they are in a place called the house of God, and there is about to be conflict. What is the conflict over? Well, verses 6 and 7 in Genesis 13 tells us that it was because the land couldn't support them dwelling together. They had too many things, and so there was strife. Now, that may have happened to you, that you had a conflict with somebody else, that you couldn't live together, that there was strife and conflict because of things. But I think that also maybe what they had a lot of here is ego. And so all of this couldn't stay together in the house of God. And it ends up that people start taking sides, and their herdsmen start fighting, and the people who are supporting them start fighting. And there's this huge conflict, which they decide, okay, it's going to be best for us to separate. And sometimes in our relationships with other Christians, that is the best thing that can happen, is for there to be a parting of ways for a season. And that's what happens here with Abram and Lot. But I want you to see how they decide. They separate from each other so that there would not be any strife, so that things would be able to calm down. And it says in verse 12 that Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and he moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now, they had a choice of where they would go once that conflict happened. Abram chose the promised land of Canaan after Lot made his choice. Lot had a choice of where to place his tent, of where to live. And he chose in the valley. But look what he does when he chooses the valley. He chooses to place his tent as close to Sodom as he could. Now, if you've been in church for very long, you're going to know the rest of the story, but Sodom was a pretty deplorable place for a number of reasons. And it seems as though Lot and his family were fairly weak. And so for Lot to take himself and his family after conflict into a place that he was going to be very vulnerable wasn't a very wise decision at all. But perhaps the worst decision that he made was placing his tent as close as he possibly could to Sodom. And in so doing, this sets in motion a chain of events which ends up affecting not just Lot, but ends up affecting his wife. It affects his daughter, it affects his wife, it affects his entire family. And so it wasn't the conflict that was the beginning of the end for Lot. It was what he chose to do after the conflict, and that was bring himself further from God and closer to danger and risk. I don't know what conflict you're facing today. If you are a child of God, the Bible says that there is going to be conflict. There is going to be persecution for your faith. If it's not for your faith, it's just going to be life that brings those things on. But how you deal with it and how you handle it makes a world of difference for you. And so, as you exit whatever conflict you're in, I want to encourage you to be careful of where you place your tent and how close you place your tent to danger in moments of weakness and vulnerability.